December of 1860. The Pease River in northwest Texas. The temperature had dropped below freezing overnight, and the grass along the riverbank was stiff with frost. A column of Texas Rangers under Captain Lawrence Sullivan Ross was moving through the low hills north of the river in near silence, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound on the hard ground. They had been tracking a Comanche camp for 3 days. A scout had spotted the lodge poles the previous afternoon, thin lines against the winter sky, and Ross had ordered his men to hold position until dawn. He wanted the light behind them when they attacked. He wanted the sun in the eyes of anyone who tried to run. The camp sat in a shallow depression near a bend in the river. 15 lodges, maybe 60 people. The scout had reported that most of the warriors were gone, away on a hunting expedition to the west, following a buffalo herd that had been spotted moving across the caprock. What remained in the camp was what always remained when the warriors left: women, children, a handful of elderly men too old to ride. The people who processed the hides, dried the meat, maintained the lodges, tended the horse herd, kept the community alive while its fighters were away. This was the camp at its most vulnerable. This was precisely why Ross had chosen this morning to attack. At first light, he gave the order. The Rangers came over the ridge at full gallop, firing as they rode. The first shots hit the lodges before anyone inside was fully awake. A woman emerged from the nearest teepee carrying a bundle and was knocked sideways by a rifle ball before she could take 3 steps. Children scattered into the grass. Horses screamed and pulled at their tethers. The Rangers rode through the camp in a line, shooting at movement, at shapes, at anything that was not a ranger. The distinction between warrior and woman, between fighter and child, between threat and helpless, dissolved in the first 30 seconds and was not re-established for the next 20 minutes. In the chaos, a woman broke from the far edge of the camp and ran north through the tall brown grass along the river. She was carrying an infant pressed against her chest with one arm, running with the uneven, desperate stride of someone who knows that speed is the only thing between her child and death. A mounted ranger spotted her and closed the distance easily, his horse covering in seconds what took her minutes on foot. He drew alongside her. She stopped running. She turned to face him. And then she did something that made the ranger pull back on his reins, so hard his horse nearly sat. She held the child up toward him and screamed a single word. Not in Comanche, in English. The word was American. She screamed it again. American, American. Her skin beneath the layers of sun damage and wind burn, and years of living on the open plains, was lighter than the other women in the camp. Her eyes, when the ranger looked closely enough to see them through the dust and the chaos and the smoke drifting from the burning lodges behind her, were blue. Her name was Cynthia Ann Parker. She had not used that name in 24 years. She had been taken from her family's settlement at Fort Parker in May of 1836, when she was 9 years old. She had grown up Comanche. She had learned their language, their customs, their way of seeing the world. She had married a war chief named Peta Nocona. She had borne him 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. She had built a life inside the nation that had taken her, and by every account that survives, she had loved that life completely. Now the men who were burning her home, and killing her people, and scattering her family's horses across the frozen prairie, were calling themselves her rescuers. But before I tell you what happened to Cynthia Ann Parker after this morning, before I reveal what the Rangers did with the other women they captured in this raid, and in dozens of raids like it across 3 decades of frontier warfare, I need to take you back. I need to show you how Texas built a fighting force whose methods against Comanche women and children were documented in their own reports, preserved in their own letters, and then systematically excluded from every history book the state produced for the next 100 years. Because what the Texas Rangers did on the frontier was not hidden by time, it was hidden by choice. You have heard of the Texas Rangers. Everyone has. They are one of the most mythologized institutions in American history. Television shows built around their name ran for decades. Novels cast them as the ultimate frontier heroes, men of iron will and unshakable moral code riding into the wilderness to protect civilization from savagery. The image is carved into the identity of Texas itself, a state that named its baseball team after them, that maintains a museum in Waco dedicated to celebrating their legacy, that teaches schoolchildren to revere them as the men who made Texas possible. That image is not entirely false. The Texas Rangers were effective. They were brave. They fought in conditions that would have broken less determined men, across terrains so vast and hostile that survival alone was an achievement. They adapted to the frontier with an ingenuity that professional military forces struggled to match. They learned to ride like Comanche. They learned to track like Comanche. They learned to fight like Comanche. And that was precisely the problem. Because when you train men to fight like their enemy, you must also decide which of their enemy's methods you will adopt and which you will reject. Texas made that decision. And the decision was to adopt all of them. The Texas Rangers were not a police force. They were not a branch of the military subject to the regulations and oversight that governed the United States Army. They were a paramilitary organization created by the Republic of Texas, and later maintained by the state with a mandate that evolved over time, but that always centered on a single objective: the removal of indigenous people from territory that Texas intended to claim for settlement. Their methods were governed not by military law or civilian statute, but by the directives of whichever governor or frontier commander held authority at the time. And those directives, as documented in correspondence preserved in the Texas State Archives, ranged from vague instructions to punish hostile Indians, to explicit orders that used the word exterminate without qualification or apology. What the Rangers did to Comanche warriors in combat was brutal, but fell within the norms of frontier warfare, as both sides understood them. What they did to Comanche women and children found in camps after raids was something different. It was documented in their own after-action reports, in letters Rangers wrote to their wives and families, in diaries kept during campaigns, and in testimony recorded from Comanche survivors decades later. These documents were not destroyed. They were not lost in fires or floods or the chaos of war. They were archived, filed, preserved in libraries and government offices where any researcher with the inclination could find them and read them. But for over a century, no Texas history textbook cited them. No school curriculum referenced them. No museum exhibit displayed them. The documents existed in the same state that housed a mythology built on their absence. The truth and the legend occupied the same filing cabinets and never touched. If you want to understand what those documents contain, what actually happened when Texas Rangers rode into Comanche camps, and what was done to the women and children they found there, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button because what I am about to reveal comes directly from the Rangers' own words, their own reports, their own letters home. This is not accusation from the outside. This is confession from within. And the reason it was kept out of the textbooks is the same reason it needs to be told now. Because silence is how a society gives itself permission to forget what it has done. To understand why Texas built the Rangers, and why their methods escalated to the point where their own reports became unpublishable in school textbooks, you need to understand what they were fighting. The Comanche were not simply another indigenous nation defending territory. They were an empire, the most powerful military force on the southern plains for over 150 years, controlling a territory so vast that the Spanish, the French, the Mexicans, and the Americans all failed to dislodge them across 3 centuries of trying. The Comancheria stretched from the Arkansas River in present-day Kansas south, through Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle, west into New Mexico, and deep into central Texas. At its peak, it covered over 250,000 square miles of grassland, river valley, and high desert. The Comanche controlled this territory not through fortifications or settlements, but through movement. They were horse people. Their entire civilization was built around the animal that the Spanish had inadvertently introduced to the plains in the 16th century. By the 1700s, the Comanche had become the most skilled mounted fighters in North America. They could ride at full gallop, hang off the side of a horse using only a heel hooked over the animal's spine, and fire arrows with lethal accuracy while presenting almost no target to an enemy. A single Comanche warrior could loose 20 arrows in the time it took a soldier to reload a musket once. European military observers who witnessed Comanche horsemanship compared them to the Mongols. It was not flattery. It was assessment. Their economy was built on two foundations: the buffalo, which provided food, clothing, shelter, tools, and trade goods, and raiding, which provided horses, captives, and material wealth taken from neighboring peoples. Raiding was not crime in Comanche culture. It was profession. A young man proved his worth through the success of his raids, the way a young man in Eastern society proved his worth through the success of his business. The targets of Comanche raids shifted over time as the frontier changed, from rival indigenous nations to Spanish settlements to Mexican ranches to, finally, the Anglo-American homesteads pushing westward into Texas. The raids on Texas settlements were devastating. They came without warning, usually at dawn or dusk, targeting isolated farms and small communities that had no means of defense against mounted warriors who struck fast and vanished before any organized response could form. The killing was efficient and purposeful. Men of fighting age died first. Elderly people who could not travel fast enough were killed. Infants who might cry and reveal the raiding party's location during the retreat were killed. Women and children of useful age were taken as captives to be adopted, traded, or enslaved. The methods were brutal by any standard, and the terror they produced among Texas settlers was genuine, deep, and generational. Families who had lost members to Comanche raids carried that grief and that fury for the rest of their lives. Communities that had been attacked lived in permanent fear of the next raid. Children grew up with nightmares about screaming in the dark and horses thundering through the yard. This fear was real. The suffering of Texas settlers who lost family to Comanche raids was real, and Texas used that fear and that suffering as the moral foundation for everything that followed. Every escalation in Ranger tactics, every expansion of their mandate, every order that pushed them deeper into Comancheria with fewer restrictions on their methods, was justified by pointing back at the raids. They did this to our people. They took our women and children. They burned our homes. Now we will do what is necessary to make sure it never happens again. The logic was simple. The emotional appeal was overwhelming, and the result was a permission structure that allowed the Rangers to do things to Comanche women and children that Texas would spend the next century trying to pretend had never happened. The Texas Rangers were born out of necessity and shaped by violence into something that no other American institution quite resembled. They were not soldiers. They were not police. They were something in between, operating in a space where the rules of both professions blurred into irrelevance, and the only law that consistently applied was the willingness to use force faster and more decisively than the enemy. Stephen F. Austin organized the first Ranger companies in 1823, when Texas was still a Mexican territory and Anglo-American settlers were just beginning to push into land that the Comanche considered theirs. The early Rangers were little more than volunteer militia, farmers who left their fields periodically to patrol the frontier and respond to raids. They were poorly equipped, poorly organized, and largely ineffective against Comanche warriors, whose mounted combat skills outclassed anything the settlers could produce. For 2 decades, the Rangers were a reactive force, arriving after the damage was done, burying the dead, and riding home. Everything changed in the 1840s under a captain named John Coffee Hayes. Hayes was the first Ranger commander who understood that the only way to fight the Comanche was to become them. He recruited men who could ride and shoot simultaneously. He abandoned the infantry tactics that the regular military still employed and adopted the Comanche model of fast-mounted raids, hitting targets at speed and withdrawing before a counterattack could organize. He trained his men to live on the land the way the Comanche did, carrying minimal supplies, sleeping in the open, covering vast distances on horseback without the logistical chain that slowed conventional armies to a crawl. But Hayes understood something else as well. The Comanche advantage in mounted combat was not just skill, it was technology. A warrior with a bow could fire continuously, while a ranger with a single-shot rifle had to stop, dismount, reload, and remount after every shot. The bow was a repeating weapon, the rifle was not. The gap was lethal. Then Samuel Colt sent a shipment of his new revolving pistols to Texas. The Colt Patterson held 5 shots. It could be fired from horseback, without reloading after every round. It was inaccurate at distance, but devastating in the close-range mounted engagements that defined Comanche warfare. In 1844, at the Battle of Walker Creek, 15 Rangers armed with Colt revolvers defeated a Comanche war party of approximately 70 warriors. The Comanche had never encountered an enemy who could match their rate of fire from horseback. The tactical balance of the frontier shifted in a single afternoon. After Walker Creek, the Rangers evolved rapidly from a defensive militia into an offensive strike force. The revolver gave them the ability to engage Comanche warriors on equal terms in mounted combat. Hayes's training methods gave them the riding skills and endurance to operate deep in Comancheria for extended periods. And the political will of the Republic of Texas, which became a state in 1845, gave them the mandate to carry the fight to the enemy rather than waiting for the enemy to come to them. This was the critical shift. The Rangers stopped defending settlements and started attacking camps. The change in strategy seemed logical from a military perspective. Why wait for the next raid when you could strike the source? Why absorb casualties on the defensive when you could inflict them on the offensive? But the shift carried a consequence that would define the next 3 decades of frontier violence and produce the documents that Texas would later work so hard to suppress. When you attack a settlement, you are attacking warriors who chose to fight. When you attack a camp, you are attacking a community, women grinding corn, children playing near the river, elderly men repairing tools, the people who keep a civilization alive between its battles. The Rangers rode into those camps knowing exactly who they would find there, and they rode in anyway. The anatomy of a Ranger raid on a Comanche camp followed a pattern that repeated with minor variations across dozens of operations from the 1840s through the 1870s. The pattern was consistent enough to constitute doctrine, even if it was never formally written as such. The Rangers learned what worked and replicated it. What worked was dawn attacks on camps when warriors were absent. Scouts would locate a camp and observe it for days, sometimes weeks, tracking the movements of hunting parties, counting warriors, mapping the terrain, identifying escape routes that would need to be cut off. The ideal moment to strike was when the largest number of fighting men were away from the camp simultaneously. A major buffalo hunt could draw off most of a band's warriors for days at a time. A raiding expedition against another tribe or a distant settlement could do the same. The scouts waited for that window, and then the Rangers moved. They approached at night, slowly, dismounting in the final miles and leading their horses through ravines and creek beds to avoid silhouetting themselves against the sky. They positioned themselves on high ground overlooking the camp, usually to the east, so that the rising sun would be behind them when they charged. They waited in the cold. Some Rangers later described these pre-dawn hours as the worst part, lying in frozen grass listening to the sounds of the camp below, dogs barking, a child crying, a woman singing while she worked to hide by firelight. The sounds of ordinary life, about to be destroyed by men who lay in the darkness, counting the minutes until they had enough light to aim. At first light, the charge. Mounted Rangers coming over the ridge or out of the tree line at full gallop, revolvers drawn, firing into the camp before anyone inside had time to process what was happening. The first targets were the horse herd. Rangers detailed specifically for this purpose rode straight for the tethered animals and either scattered them or shot them where they stood. Without horses, no one in the camp could flee at speed. Without horses, any warriors who returned from the hunt would arrive on foot against mounted enemies. The horse kill was not incidental to the raid. It was the raid's strategic center. Everything else followed from it. With the horses gone, the Rangers swept through the camp. They fired into lodges. They shot at figures emerging from the teepee flaps, figures that in the half-light of dawn and the smoke of lodges already catching fire from overturned cooking fires were shapes rather than identifiable human beings. Ranger after-action reports use language that reveals the indiscriminate nature of these first minutes. Hostiles engaged, enemy killed, resistance overcome. The language of combat applied to a scene that included women holding children, elderly men struggling to stand, teenagers who had never held a weapon trying to run in directions where no mounted ranger waited with a revolver. The killing in the first minutes of a camp raid was not surgical. It was not targeted. It was volume fire directed at a concentrated population in an enclosed space. Some rangers acknowledged this in private correspondence, with a frankness that never appeared in official reports. One letter from a ranger who participated in a raid in the 1850s describes shooting a figure running between lodges and discovering afterward that it was a woman carrying a child in a cradleboard on her back. Both were dead. The ranger mentions this without expressed remorse, but also without the triumphant language that characterized descriptions of combat with warriors. The tone is closer to accounting. A notation of what happened, a fact recorded and left without commentary for the reader to interpret. The destruction of resources followed the killing. Every lodge was burned. Every food store, the pemmican and dried buffalo meat, and processed berries that would sustain the band through winter, was either taken or destroyed. Robes and blankets were piled and set alight. Tools, weapons, cooking implements, the accumulated material culture of a functioning community were smashed or scattered. The thoroughness was deliberate. A band that lost its camp in December or January, with no food stores and no shelter, faced starvation and exposure as certainties rather than possibilities. The Rangers understood this. Their reports described the destruction of resources with the same strategic satisfaction they applied to enemy casualties. Lodges destroyed, provisions burned, horse herd eliminated. The language of logistics applied to the annihilation of a community's ability to survive. After the shooting stopped and the lodges burned, the Rangers collected the survivors. This is where the official reports and the private accounts begin to diverge most sharply. The official reports describe prisoners taken. They note numbers: 12 women and children captured, 8 women and 6 children secured. The language is administrative. It implies an orderly process. It suggests that capture was a controlled operation conducted according to some understood protocol. The private accounts tell a different story. Comanche women did not surrender passively. They fought. They fought with knives, with lodge poles, with rocks, with their hands and teeth when nothing else was available. They fought for the same reason any human being fights when strangers on horseback ride into their home at dawn and start killing. Ranger accounts describe women who charged mounted men armed with nothing but a skinning blade, women who threw themselves over their children and refused to move, women who screamed in a language the Rangers did not understand and kept screaming until they were struck hard enough to stop. The Rangers interpreted this resistance as confirmation that Comanche women were as savage as their men. The possibility that a mother fighting to protect her child from armed strangers was exhibiting the most universal human response imaginable did not appear in their analysis. Women who resisted were beaten into compliance. This is documented not by external critics, but by the Rangers themselves. in letters where they describe what was necessary to subdue female prisoners with the same matter-of-fact tone they used to describe breaking a horse that refused the saddle. One account from an 1852 raid describes a woman who refused to stop fighting until she was struck across the face with a pistol barrel hard enough to break her jaw. The ranger notes that after this she became compliant. Another account describes binding a woman's hands behind her back with rawhide straps pulled tight enough that her wrists swelled and turned dark within hours. She had been trying to reach a child that the rangers had separated from her during the initial assault. The binding was not punishment for violence. It was punishment for the refusal to stop reaching for her child. The captured women were not treated as prisoners of war. This distinction is essential to understanding everything that followed. The United States and the Republic of Texas, before it did not recognize the Comanche as a sovereign nation. The Comanche were classified as hostile tribes, a legal category that denied them the protections afforded to combatants under the laws of war that governed conflicts between recognized states. A Mexican soldier captured in battle had rights. A British sailor taken at sea had rights. A Comanche woman pulled from the wreckage of her home had none. She was not a prisoner. She was seized property. Contraband. Material recovered during a law enforcement operation against criminal elements on Texas soil. The legal classification shaped the physical reality. Captured women were bound and forced to march on foot behind the mounted ranger column during the journey back to Texas settlements. These marches covered distances that could take days or weeks depending on how deep into Comancheria the raid had penetrated. The women walked, the rangers rode. The pace was set by the horses. A woman who could not maintain that pace was a problem the rangers solved, in ways their reports address only through implication. Stragglers were encouraged to keep moving. Encouraged is the word the reports use. The methods of encouragement are not described. They did not need to be. Every ranger reading those reports understood what encouraged meant when applied to a captive who had fallen behind the column on a forced march across open plains. Think about the calculation embedded in that legal distinction for a moment. A nation defines its enemy as something less than an enemy, not a combatant but a criminal, not a prisoner but property. And once that definition is established, everything becomes permissible because the rules that govern the treatment of enemies no longer apply. The women marching behind those horses had no treaty to protect them, no convention, no code. They had only the individual conscience of the men who held their ropes. And those men had been trained, conditioned, and authorized to view them not as women, but as the source of the threat that had terrorized Texas settlements for generations. Let me know in the comments what you think happens when a society removes every legal and moral restraint from how its soldiers treat captured people. Because what comes next is the answer. The event that transformed the Texas Comanche conflict from a frontier border war into something approaching a campaign of annihilation took place on March 19, 1840 in San Antonio. It is known as the Council House Fight, and its consequences for Comanche women would reverberate for the next 35 years. By 1840, both sides had reason to seek peace. Texas settlers were exhausted by years of raids. The Comanche, facing increasing pressure from westward expansion, recognized that negotiation might preserve what warfare was slowly costing them. A council was arranged. Comanche chiefs from the Penateca Band agreed to come to San Antonio to discuss terms. The Texans had one primary demand: the return of all white captives held by the Comanche. The chiefs agreed to bring captives as a gesture of good faith. On the appointed day, 65 Comanche arrived at the council house in San Antonio. Chiefs, warriors, women, and children. They brought with them a single white captive, Matilda Lockhart. She was 16 years old. She had been in Comanche captivity for 2 years. When the Texan commissioners saw her, the negotiation effectively ended before it began. Matilda Lockhart's condition shocked men who considered themselves hardened by frontier life. Mary Maverick, a San Antonio resident who helped care for the girl after her release, described what she saw. Matilda's nose had been burned off. The flesh was gone entirely, leaving exposed bone and 2 open nostrils denuded of tissue. Her head, arms, and face were covered in bruises and sores. Burns covered her body, the result of systematic torture inflicted over months. She was barely able to speak above a whisper. She told the commissioners that other captives were being held by different bands, and that the Comanche intended to ransom them one at a time, extracting maximum payment for each. The Texan commissioners were furious. They had expected all captives returned at once. They interpreted the Comanche strategy of individual ransom as deliberate bad faith. They decided to take the chiefs hostage until all captives were produced. Soldiers were brought into the council house. The Texan commissioners informed the chiefs they would be held prisoner. The Comanche understood immediately what was happening. A chief drew a knife. A soldier fired. Within minutes, the council house was a slaughter. When the fighting ended, 35 Comanche were dead. Chiefs, warriors, women who had accompanied the delegation, and children who had been playing outside the building. 27 Comanche women and children who survived were taken prisoner and held in San Antonio. 7 Texans were dead and several more wounded. The Peace Council had become a massacre, and both sides knew that everything that followed would be shaped by what happened in that room. The Comanche response was immediate and devastating. War parties swept through Texas in what became known as the Great Raid of 1840. They burned Linville on the Gulf Coast. They killed settlers across a swath of territory stretching hundreds of miles. They took captives, and they executed prisoners they already held in retaliation for the council house dead. 13 captives, including Matilda Lockhart's younger sister, who was 6 years old, were tortured and killed. The methods were deliberate. The message was clear. You killed our people under a flag of truce. Now your people will pay. Texas responded to the Great Raid with a fury that obliterated whatever restraints had previously governed ranger operations. The council house fight and the retaliatory killings that followed created a cycle of violence in which each atrocity justified the next. The Rangers had seen what was done to Matilda Lockhart. They had buried the settlers killed in the Great Raid. They had heard the descriptions of how the 13 captives died. Every raid they conducted from that point forward carried the emotional weight of those events. Every Comanche camp they destroyed was retribution. Every woman they captured was the enemy who had burned off Matilda Lockhart's nose. The individual humanity of the people in those camps disappeared behind a wall of accumulated grief and rage that Texas had no interest in dismantling, because that wall was useful. It permitted things that would otherwise have required justification. After the council house fight, no justification was necessary. The Rangers had permission, and they used it. After the council house fight, the language in official Texas correspondence changed. The shift was subtle in some documents and explicit in others, but the direction was consistent. The Comanche were no longer described as a military adversary to be defeated. They were described as a problem to be eliminated. Governor Mirabeau Lamar, who held office during the council house fight and its aftermath, made his position clear in communications that survive in the Texas State Archives. He rejected his predecessor Sam Houston's policy of negotiation and diplomacy with indigenous nations. Lamar viewed the Comanche as an obstacle to Texas expansion that could not be negotiated with, only removed. His directives to ranger commanders used language that left little room for interpretation. The word exterminate appears in official correspondence from this period, not as rhetoric, as instruction. The strategy that emerged from this mandate was not simply to win battles against Comanche war parties. It was to destroy the Comanche capacity to function as a people, and the men who designed this strategy understood exactly what that required. The Comanche were not a nation that could be defeated by killing its soldiers. They were a nation whose survival depended on a web of interconnected functions performed by every member of the community. Warriors hunted and fought, but women processed the buffalo that fed and clothed the band. Women built and maintained the lodges. Women preserved the food stores that sustained the community through winter. Women raised the children who would become the next generation of Comanche. Women held the knowledge systems, the language, the cultural practices, the methods of survival on the plains that had been refined over centuries. Destroy the warriors, and the women would rebuild. Destroy the women's ability to perform their functions, and the entire civilization would collapse. The Rangers understood this with a clarity that their reports reveal in the cold language of strategic assessment. After-action reports from the 1840s and 50s describe the destruction of camp resources with an emphasis that goes beyond military necessity into something more deliberate. Lodge skins were not merely burned. They were counted. 23 lodges destroyed. 31 lodges destroyed. 40 lodges and all provisions destroyed. The numbers mattered because each lodge represented a family unit whose capacity to survive the next season had been eliminated. Each food store destroyed represented weeks or months of labor by women who had processed buffalo meat and berries into pemmican through techniques that required skill and time and could not be replicated quickly. Destroying a winter's food supply in December was not a tactical strike. It was a death sentence delivered not by bullet but by starvation, executed not against warriors but against the women and children and elderly who depended on those stores to live. The killing and capture of women during raids served the same strategic logic. Every woman taken from a Comanche band reduced that band's ability to process hides, prepare food, build shelters, and raise children. The Rangers did not need to articulate this in explicit strategic documents because the logic was self-evident to men who had spent years observing how Comanche society functioned. They knew which targets mattered. They knew that a camp full of women was not a secondary target. It was the primary target. The warriors would fight and die on the plains regardless. It was the women who determined whether the Comanche nation survived or perished. And so, it was the women the Rangers went after, with a consistency that transformed individual raids into a campaign of systematic destruction aimed at the demographic and cultural foundations of an entire people. Some Rangers saw this clearly and said so in private. A letter written by a Ranger who served in the 1850s, preserved in a family archive and later donated to a university collection, describes the strategy with a frankness that never appeared in official channels. He wrote that every camp they burned was worth more than every warrior they killed, that the women were the real enemy, because without them the Comanche could not replace what they lost. He did not write this with pride or with shame. He wrote it as observation, as a man describing the mechanics of a machine he operated without questioning its purpose. The machine's purpose was destruction. The women were its primary material, and the Rangers fed it with the efficiency of men who believed they were doing necessary work. The journey from the site of a raid back to Texas settlements could take days or weeks, depending on how deep into Comancheria the Rangers had penetrated. For the captured Comanche women, this journey was a sustained ordeal that stripped away whatever the raid itself had not already destroyed. They walked. The Rangers rode. This was not a logistical necessity, but a deliberate arrangement. The Rangers had captured horses during the raid. Horses were available. But mounting a Comanche woman on a horse meant giving her the one tool she needed to escape. A Comanche woman on horseback in open country could outride most of the Rangers pursuing her. She had grown up on horses. She could ride bareback at speeds that men raised in saddles could not match. So the women walked, bound at the wrists, connected to each other or to a ranger's saddle by lengths of rawhide, moving at whatever pace the column set. The pace was punishing. Rangers on campaign moved fast. They wanted to clear Comancheria before returning warriors discovered the destroyed camp and organized pursuit. A column covering 30 or 40 miles a day on horseback was manageable. A woman on foot covering the same distance over rough terrain, often barefoot because her moccasins had been lost or destroyed during the raid, could not maintain that pace without consequences that accumulated with each mile. blistered feet became infected. Dehydration set in under the Texas sun. Women who had been injured during the raid, struck by bullets, or beaten during capture, deteriorated as wounds that might have healed with rest instead worsened with every step. Women who fell behind the column were dealt with according to the unwritten protocols of the march. Some accounts describe rangers dismounting to strike women who had stopped walking. Others describe women being dragged by the rawhide tethers, connecting them to mounted riders until they regained their feet or until the skin around their wrists tore through. The official reports do not describe these methods. They note only that all prisoners were delivered to the destination. The condition in which they were delivered, the damage accumulated across days of forced marching, is recorded only in the observations of the people who received them at the other end. But the physical toll of the march was not what broke these women. What broke them was what happened to their children. During the chaos of a dawn raid, children scattered. They ran in every direction, driven by the same instinct that drives any small creature caught in a sudden storm of noise and violence. Some ran into the grass and hid. Some were scooped up by women who were themselves trying to flee. Some were found in lodges after the shooting stopped, crouched beneath buffalo robes or pressed against the bodies of adults who had been killed around them. The Rangers collected children the way they collected other assets from the camp, as items to be cataloged and transported. But the children were not kept with their mothers. Ranger reports describe women and children as separate categories of prisoner, counted independently, transported in different groups within the column. A woman marching at the rear of the column might know that her child had been taken alive during the raid, but have no way to see the child, speak to the child, or confirm that the child was still with the column at all. Some children were sent ahead with faster-moving elements of the Ranger force. Some were handed off to settlers encountered along the return route, who expressed willingness to take them. Some simply disappeared from the column's inventory between the raid site and the destination, their absence unrecorded and unexplained. For the women, the separation was a wound that made every other wound irrelevant. Comanche oral histories recorded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries described the loss of children during Ranger raids as the defining trauma of the entire conflict, worse than the killing, worse than the burning of camps, worse than the destruction of the horse herds. A woman who lost her lodge could build another. A woman who lost her food stores could process more buffalo when the herds returned. A woman who lost her child to a column of mounted strangers, riding east with no intention of returning that child, lost something that could not be rebuilt, replaced, or recovered. The grief was permanent, and the Rangers knew it was permanent. They understood that separating mothers from children inflicted a damage that no physical punishment could match. Whether they chose this method deliberately as a weapon or simply allowed it to happen through indifference, the result was the same. It destroyed women more completely than anything else the Rangers could have done to them. The captured women arrived at Texas settlements as trophies. There is no other word that accurately describes how frontier communities received them. After years of living in fear of Comanche raids, after burying neighbors and family members killed in those raids, after hearing the stories of what happened to captives like Matilda Lockhart, the settlers of central and western Texas viewed captured Comanche women not as prisoners deserving humane treatment, but as symbols of retribution, proof that the people who had terrorized them were finally being made to pay. At some frontier towns, the arrival of a ranger column with Comanche prisoners drew crowds. People came from surrounding farms and settlements to see the captives the way they might come to see a traveling exhibition. The women were displayed, not formally, not on platforms or stages, but displayed nonetheless. Paraded through town on foot, still bound, still bearing the injuries of the raid and the march, while residents lined the street and stared. Some threw things, some shouted. Some simply watched in silence, studying the faces of women who represented everything they had feared and hated for as long as they could remember. The women who had held status in their communities, wives of chiefs and prominent warriors, women who had commanded respect and wielded authority within the complex social structure of Comanche society, were singled out for particular attention. Settlers who learned that a captive was the wife of a known war chief, a man whose raids had killed people they knew, focused their anger on her with a specificity that went beyond general hostility. She became a surrogate for a man they could not reach, his wife, his property, in the framework they understood, the closest they could get to punishing someone they held responsible for their suffering. What happened during these public displays varied by settlement and by the temperament of whoever held local authority. Some accounts describe verbal abuse, sustained and violent in its language, directed at women who could not understand a word being said to them, but who understood the tone and the faces and the gestures with absolute clarity. Other accounts describe physical contact. Women struck by civilians who pushed past rangers to reach them, women spat upon, women whose clothing, already damaged from the raid and the march, was torn further by hands reaching out of the crowd. The rangers sometimes intervened, sometimes they did not. Their reports note that prisoners were delivered to the appropriate authorities. What happened between the edge of town and the appropriate authorities is a space the reports do not fill. At military forts, conditions were marginally more controlled, but not meaningfully more humane. Captured Comanche women were held in guardhouses or stockades designed for military prisoners. They were given rations, which they often refused because the food was unfamiliar, and because many women in the immediate aftermath of a raid and forced march were in a state of shock so profound that basic functions like eating required effort they could not produce. They were sometimes examined by military surgeons whose notes provide some of the only clinical documentation of the physical condition of women after ranger raids: bruising consistent with blunt force trauma, lacerations to the wrists from binding, dehydration, malnutrition, injuries from gunshot wounds that had received no treatment, broken bones that had begun to set incorrectly during the march. The surgeons recorded these observations in the same files where they recorded the health of soldiers and livestock, one more category of physical inventory to be assessed and documented. The women who arrived at these forts carrying infants faced an additional cruelty that the military administered with bureaucratic indifference. Children were frequently separated from their mothers upon arrival. The rationale, when one was offered, was that children would be placed with Christian families who could raise them properly. Properly meaning, as English-speaking, church-attending members of Texas society rather than as Comanche. Infants were taken from women who had carried them through a raid and across hundreds of miles of open country, who had kept them alive through everything the rangers and the landscape had thrown at them, and handed to strangers who would give them new names and never tell them where they came from. The mothers were not consulted. They were not informed of where their children were being sent. They were restrained if they resisted, and then they were left in the stockade with empty arms and the knowledge that somewhere in this alien world their child was being transformed into someone who would never know them. Now let me take you back to the Peace River, to the woman standing in the frozen grass, holding up an infant and screaming a word she had not spoken in 24 years. American. American. Because the story of Cynthia Ann Parker contains everything. Every contradiction, every cruelty, every impossible choice that defined the Texas Comanche conflict, compressed into the life of a single woman who belonged to both worlds and was destroyed by both. Cynthia Ann was 9 years old on the morning of May 19, 1836, when a Comanche war party attacked Fort Parker, a small settlement in east-central Texas where her extended family had built a compound surrounded by a wooden stockade. The attack was swift and overwhelming. Her grandfather, Elder John Parker, was killed at the gate. Her father was killed. Her uncle was killed. Her aunt, Elizabeth Kellogg, was taken captive. Her cousin, Rachel Plummer, was taken. and Cynthia Ann was taken, lifted onto a horse by a warrior and carried away from everything she had known into a world she could not yet imagine. For the first years, she resisted. Accounts from traders and intermediaries who encountered her during ransom negotiations in the late 1830s describe a girl who still spoke English, who still asked about her family, who still clearly identified as a white captive rather than a Comanche. But with each passing year, the balance shifted. She learned the Comanche language. She learned to ride, to process hides, to build lodges, to perform the work that sustained a Comanche band on the plains. She forgot English slowly, word by word, the way a river forgets its source as it moves further from the mountains. By her mid-teens, traders who met her reported that she refused to speak English and showed no interest in returning to Texas. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had become Comanche. She married Peta Nakona, a war chief of the Nakoni Band. He was by all surviving accounts a formidable man, respected among the Comanche for his leadership and his success in raids. Cynthia Ann bore him 3 children, 2 sons, Quanah and Pecos, and a daughter, Topsana, whose name meant prairie flower. She lived among the Nakoni for nearly 2 decades as a full member of the band, performing the same roles as any other Comanche woman, raising her children in the traditions of the people who had taken her and whom she now considered her own. Then December of 1860 came. Sol Ross and his rangers found the camp on the Pease River. The attack unfolded the way every ranger attack on a Comanche camp unfolded. Dawn, gunfire, burning lodges, screaming horses, and in the chaos, a woman running with an infant, turning to face a mounted ranger, and screaming the only English word she could still summon from a language she had abandoned 2 decades earlier. Ross recognized what he had found. A white woman living among the Comanche was a prize of enormous political value. He took Cynthia Ann and her daughter Prairie Flower into custody and sent word to the Texas authorities that the Parker girl, taken 24 years ago, had been recovered. Texas celebrated. Newspapers published the story as a triumph of ranger heroism. A white woman rescued from savagery. A lost daughter returned to civilization. The narrative was irresistible. It confirmed everything Texas wanted to believe about itself and about the Comanche. Civilization had reclaimed one of its own. Cynthia Ann did not experience her rescue as liberation. She experienced it as a second captivity. She fought against the rangers who took her. She wept for her husband. She begged to be returned to the Comanche in a language the rangers could not understand and would not have heeded if they could. Her sons, Quanah and Pecos, had escaped during the raid. Peta Nakona was reported killed in the attack, though some Comanche accounts say he survived the Pease River fight and died later from a wound or illness. Regardless, Cynthia Ann would never see him again. She would never see her sons again. The only piece of her Comanche life that remained was Prairie Flower, the infant she had been carrying when the ranger closed the distance in the frozen grass. Texas gave Cynthia Ann to her uncle, Isaac Parker, who took her to his home in East Texas and set about the work of restoring her to civilization. The project failed from its first day. Cynthia Ann did not speak English. She had not spoken it in over 2 decades, and the language returned to her only in fragments, isolated words surfacing like debris from a shipwreck, disconnected from the fluency she had once possessed as a child. She communicated in Comanche, a language no one around her understood. She gestured. She wept. She sat in silence for hours, staring in the direction of the plains she could no longer reach. Her family watched her constantly. Not out of cruelty, though the effect was indistinguishable from it. They watched her because she tried to escape, repeatedly. She took horses when she could get access to them, and rode west until someone caught her and brought her back. She left on foot when horses were unavailable. Each attempt was intercepted. Each return was followed by tighter restrictions on her movement. The family that believed it was saving her was imprisoning her. The walls of Isaac Parker's homestead were as effective as any stockade. The doors were not locked with iron, but with the constant presence of relatives who never let her out of their sight. The Texas legislature granted Cynthia Ann a pension and a league of land in recognition of her suffering. She did not understand what a pension was. She did not want land in Texas. She wanted to go home. Home was not a place on any map the legislature recognized. Home was a band of Noconi Comanche somewhere on the plains, a husband who might be alive or dead, 2 sons she had last seen running into the grass as rangers burned everything around them. The pension and the land were Texas's way of closing the story. The lost girl found, the captive freed, the account settled. That Cynthia Ann did not consider herself lost or freed was an inconvenience the narrative could not accommodate. Prairie Flower, the daughter she had carried through the raid, was the single thread connecting Cynthia Ann to the life she had been torn from. The child was her proof that her Comanche life had been real, that she had been a wife and mother in a world that the people around her dismissed as savagery. She held Prairie Flower constantly. She spoke to her in Comanche, singing the songs she had learned on the plains, telling her daughter stories about a father and brothers the child would never remember. Prairie Flower was everything. In 1864, Prairie Flower contracted influenza. She was 4 years old. The illness moved quickly through her small body. There was no Comanche medicine woman to prepare the treatments Cynthia Ann would have trusted. There were Texas doctors whose methods she did not understand and whose language she could barely follow. Prairie Flower died. The last living connection between Cynthia Ann and her Comanche family was gone. What followed was described by family members with a helplessness that suggests they understood, perhaps for the first time, the magnitude of what had been done to this woman. Cynthia Ann stopped eating. Not abruptly, not as a dramatic gesture, but gradually, the way a person stops doing something when the reason for doing it has disappeared. She grew thinner. She stopped speaking. Even the fragments of English she had recovered, and the Comanche that no one around her understood. She sat. She stared west. She waited for something that was not coming. Cynthia Ann Parker died in 1870. The official cause was influenza, the same disease that had killed her daughter. Some historians believe she had simply stopped sustaining her own body, that the disease found a host that had already surrendered, that she had chosen to die the only way available to a woman who was watched every hour of every day by people who called themselves her family, but whom she experienced as her captors. She was buried in Texas, far from the plains, far from the Peace River, far from everything she had loved. She had been captured twice, once by the Comanche at age 9, once by the Texas Rangers at age 33. The first capture gave her a life, a husband, children, a community, a language, an identity. The second capture took all of it away and replaced it with a pension she did not want and a league of land in a state she did not recognize as home. Texas called the first capture a tragedy and the second a rescue. Cynthia Ann would not have agreed with either description. She would have said, if anyone had been able to understand her, that she had been taken from her family twice, and that the second time was worse because the second time there was no adapting, no learning, no slow transformation into someone who could find meaning in the new world. The second time, there was only loss. Cynthia Ann Parker's story is the one that survived because she was white, because her capture and recapture fit a narrative that Texas could use, even if the details of that narrative contradicted the version Texas preferred to tell. But Cynthia Ann was one woman. Behind her story, invisible to the history that celebrated her rescue, were hundreds of Comanche women whose experiences followed the same pattern without the single detail that made Cynthia Ann's story publishable. They were not white. They were Comanche. And Comanche women taken by Texas Rangers did not get pensions or leagues of land or newspaper stories about their liberation. They got stockades. They got forced marches. They got their children taken. And, eventually, they got the reservation. The end came in 1875. The Red River War, the final military campaign against the Comanche and their allies on the southern plains, broke the last free bands and forced their surrender at Fort Sill in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. The campaign was not fought primarily by Texas Rangers. By the 1870s, the United States Army had assumed the lead role in frontier military operations, and the Rangers had transitioned toward law enforcement functions in settled areas. But the strategy the Army employed against the Comanche in the Red River War was the same strategy the Rangers had pioneered 3 decades earlier. Attack the camps, destroy the horse herds, burn the lodges, eliminate the food stores, force the bands onto the reservation by making survival off the reservation impossible. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie's attack on Palo Duro Canyon in September of 1874 was the decisive blow. His soldiers descended into the canyon at dawn, destroyed the Comanche camp, captured over 1,000 horses, and then, on Mackenzie's direct orders, shot the entire herd. The killing took hours. Over 1,000 animals, the foundation of Comanche life, destroyed in a single morning. The gunfire echoed off the canyon walls so continuously that soldiers later described it as a single, unbroken sound that lasted from mid-morning until afternoon. The Comanche who escaped the canyon did so on foot, without food, without shelter, without horses, in the approaching winter of the southern plains. They had nowhere to go except Fort Sill. They came in through the winter and spring, band by band, family by family, walking into the reservation because walking was all they could do. The warriors surrendered their weapons. The women carried what remained of their possessions on their backs. The children walked beside mothers who were leading them into a world that had been designed to erase everything those children had been born into. The Comanche Nation, which had dominated the southern plains for 150 years, which had defeated the Spanish and the Mexicans and had fought the Texans and the Americans to a standstill for decades, ceased to exist as a free people in the spring of 1875. For Comanche women, the reservation was not peace. It was the final phase of the same campaign that had begun with ranger raids on their camps 30 years earlier. Everything that defined their role in Comanche society was systematically eliminated. There were no buffalo to process. The great herds had been slaughtered by commercial hunters, operating with the tacit encouragement of the federal government, which understood that destroying the buffalo destroyed the Plains nations more effectively than any military campaign. There were no lodges to build because the government provided wooden houses that Comanche women had no tradition of maintaining. There were no camps to manage, no seasonal migrations to organize, no horse herds to tend. The skills that had made Comanche women essential to their community's survival were suddenly useless. The knowledge they carried, accumulated across generations of life on the plains, had no application in a world of government rations and wooden buildings and fenced boundaries. The rations were inadequate by design. The government provided food in quantities calculated to sustain life but not comfort, and distributed it on schedules that required compliance with reservation rules. Miss a census count, lose your rations. Fail to send your children to the agency school, lose your rations. Participate in traditional ceremonies the government had banned, lose your rations. Food was leverage. Hunger was policy. The women who had once fed their families through skill and labor now fed them through obedience. Standing in line at the agency building to receive flour and beef from officials who controlled their survival the way the women had once controlled their own. Then they came for the children. The federal government's Indian boarding school program, launched in the late 1870s under the philosophy that Captain Richard Henry Pratt summarized as "kill the Indian, save the man," targeted Comanche children, along with children from every other reservation nation. The schools were located hundreds of miles from the reservations: Carlisle in Pennsylvania, Chilocco in northern Oklahoma, Haskell in Kansas. distances so great that a child sent to one of these institutions effectively disappeared from her mother's life as completely as if she had been taken in a ranger raid. The children were removed from their families through a combination of coercion and force. Agents pressured mothers to surrender their children voluntarily by threatening ration reductions for families that refused. When pressure failed, children were simply taken, loaded onto wagons and transported away from the reservation while their mothers watched from the agency buildings where they had no authority to intervene and no power to resist. Comanche women who had survived decades of ranger raids, who had endured capture and forced marches, and the destruction of their camps, and the slaughter of their horses, and the long walk to Fort Sill, now stood in the dust of the reservation and watched their children carried away by a government that called the removal education. At the schools, the children were processed through a system designed to erase their identity with an efficiency that would have impressed the rangers who had burned their camps. Their hair was cut. Their clothes were taken and replaced with uniforms. Their names were replaced with English names chosen from lists. A child who had been called by a Comanche name given by her mother at birth became Mary, or Sarah, or Ruth, assigned arbitrarily, written in a ledger alongside a number. They were forbidden to speak Comanche. Children caught speaking their language were beaten, locked in closets, forced to hold bars of soap in their mouths until they gagged. They were forbidden to practice any element of Comanche culture. They were forbidden to sing Comanche songs. They were forbidden to tell Comanche stories. They were forbidden to be Comanche. The mortality rates at these schools were staggering. Disease swept through dormitories where dozens of children slept in close quarters with inadequate nutrition and minimal medical care. Tuberculosis, influenza, measles, and pneumonia killed children in numbers that the schools recorded with the same administrative detachment that characterized every other institution that had processed Comanche lives into paperwork. At Carlisle alone, the cemetery holds the remains of over 180 children who died at the school. Many graves are marked with names that were not the names their mothers gave them. Some are marked only with numbers. Comanche mothers on the reservation received sporadic news of their children through letters that the schools required students to write in English, a language many children were still learning and that their mothers could not read. Some mothers walked to the agency building and asked interpreters to read the letters aloud. The letters were formulaic, supervised by school staff, scrubbed of any honest expression of what the children were experiencing. I am well. I am learning. I am happy. Words written under the supervision of people who would punish any deviation from the approved message. The mothers listened to these letters and understood, with the instinct that no amount of distance or bureaucratic language could suppress, that their children were not well, were not happy, were being unmade. Some children never came home. They died at the schools and were buried there. In cemeteries their mothers would never visit, under headstones bearing names their mothers did not recognize. Some children came home after years of absence and could no longer speak to their mothers. The language had been beaten out of them so thoroughly that the Comanche words they had spoken as children were gone, replaced by English that their mothers could not understand. Mother and child stood facing each other across a gap that both sides had been powerless to prevent, speaking languages the other could not follow, connected by blood and memory, and separated by a government policy designed to make exactly this moment happen. This was the final punishment. Not the ranger raids, not the forced marches, not the burning of camps or the killing of horses, or the stockades at frontier forts. The final punishment was the destruction of the bond between Comanche mothers and their children, accomplished not through violence, but through paperwork, through policy, through the slow machinery of institutions that processed human beings into categories and filed the results in cabinets where they would sit unread for 100 years. The documents exist. This is the fact that transforms everything you have heard from a tragedy into a scandal. The Ranger After Action reports, describing what happened in Comanche camps, are preserved in the Texas State Archives in Austin. The letters rangers wrote to their families describing the treatment of captured women sit in university collections across the state. The military correspondence discussing the strategy of destroying Comanche communities through targeting women and resources is filed in federal archives in Washington. The Comanche oral histories recorded by ethnographers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries are stored in libraries and research institutions. None of this material was lost. None of it was destroyed. None of it was hidden behind classified designations or sealed by court order. It was simply never used. For over a century, Texas constructed a version of its frontier history that required the exclusion of specific facts. The process was not accidental. It was deliberate, repeated with each generation of textbooks, each curriculum revision, each museum exhibit that chose which stories to display and which to store in the basement. The Texas Rangers were presented as heroes. Their courage was real and was documented. Their skill was real and was celebrated. Their role in making Texas settlement possible was real and was emphasized. What was removed, carefully, consistently, across decades of editorial decisions, was what they did to the people who were already there. The textbooks adopted by Texas public schools described ranger campaigns against the Comanche in the language of military achievement. Engagements won, territory secured, hostile threats neutralized. The word Comanche appeared as a category of obstacle rather than a category of people. The women in the camps were not mentioned. The children separated from their mothers were not mentioned. The forced marches were not mentioned. The public displays of captive women in frontier towns were not mentioned. The destruction of food stores timed to coincide with the onset of winter, a tactic designed to produce starvation among non-combatants, was not mentioned. The textbooks told a story in which the Rangers fought warriors on an empty landscape and won. The women, the children, the elderly, the communities that gave those warriors something to fight for, were edited out of the narrative as thoroughly as if they had never existed. The Texas Ranger Hall of Fame and Museum in Waco, which remains the primary public institution dedicated to Ranger history, reflects the same editorial choices. Its exhibits celebrate bravery, marksmanship, frontier justice, and the taming of a wild land. Visitors can see revolvers carried by famous Rangers. They can read accounts of legendary gunfights. They can study maps of campaigns and admire artifacts recovered from frontier posts. What they cannot find in any exhibit or display or interpretive panel is a detailed account of what happened to Comanche women captured during those campaigns. The museum tells visitors what the Rangers did. It does not tell visitors what the Rangers did to the people who could not fight back. This is not an accusation of conspiracy. It is a description of how historical narratives are constructed. Every museum, every textbook, every curriculum makes choices about what to include and what to omit. Those choices are shaped by what a society wants to believe about itself. Texas wanted to believe that the Rangers were heroes. Including the treatment of Comanche women in that narrative would have complicated the heroism beyond what the narrative could bear. So the complications were removed, not by burning documents or falsifying records, but by the simpler and more effective method of never mentioning them. Silence is the most efficient form of censorship. It requires no effort to maintain. It leaves no evidence of its operation. It simply allows the absence of information to do the work that active suppression would make conspicuous. And yet one story broke through. One story that Texas could not silence because it was too dramatic, too symbolic, too deeply embedded in the mythology of the frontier to be removed. The story of Cynthia Ann Parker. But even that story was edited. Texas told it as a rescue narrative. A white woman saved from captivity. A lost daughter returned. The version in which Cynthia Ann did not want to be saved, in which she spent the last decade of her life trying to escape back to the Comanche, in which she starved herself to death after losing everything the Rangers had taken from her. That version was not the one Texas taught its children. That version was too honest. And honest was not what the narrative required. Quanah Parker never forgot his mother. The son Cynthia Ann had last seen running into the grass during the Pease River raid grew up to become the last great chief of the Comanche people. He led the final resistance against the army on the southern plains. He fought at the Battle of Adobe Walls in 1874. He led warriors in the Red River War. And when the war was lost, and the Comanche walked into Fort Sill to surrender, Quanah was the one who negotiated the terms. He understood that fighting was finished. He understood that the Comanche would need to survive through adaptation rather than resistance. And he spent the rest of his life doing exactly that, building political relationships with Texas ranchers and federal officials, advocating for his people's rights on the reservation, becoming one of the most influential Native American leaders of the late 19th century. But through all of it, through the diplomacy and the politics and the slow work of keeping his people alive inside a system designed to erase them, Quanah searched for his mother. He knew she had been taken at Pease River. He knew she had been returned to her white family in Texas. He did not know where she had been buried. For years, he sent letters and dispatched intermediaries to track the location of her grave. The son who had been separated from his mother by Texas Rangers as a child spent decades as an adult trying to find where Texas had put her body. He found her. Cynthia Ann had been buried in Fosterville, Texas, in a small cemetery that reflected the marginal status she had occupied in the white world she had never accepted as her own. Quanah arranged to have her remains moved. In 1910, he had his mother and his sister, Prairie Flower, reinterred at the Post Oak Mission Cemetery near Cache, Oklahoma, on the land where the Comanche Reservation was located. He brought her home. Not to the plains where she had lived as a free woman, not to the banks of the Pease River where she had raised her children, but as close to home as the world that had been built on the ruins of Comancheria would allow. Quanah Parker died in 1911, less than a year after bringing his mother home. He was buried beside her. The son who had been separated from his mother at gunpoint on a frozen December morning in 1860 finally lay next to her again, 51 years later, in Oklahoma soil that had once been the eastern edge of the Comanche world. The headstone does not tell the full story. No headstone could. The Comanche Nation today numbers approximately 17,000 enrolled members. They are headquartered in Lawton, Oklahoma, on land that bears no resemblance to the open plains their ancestors dominated for a century and a half. The language that the boarding schools tried to destroy is being taught again, slowly, painstakingly, by elders who are the last generation to have learned it from parents who spoke it as their first tongue. The oral histories that recorded what happened during the Ranger campaigns are being preserved by tribal historians who understand that if they are not recorded now, they will be lost when the last people who heard them from their grandmothers are gone. The Texas Ranger Museum in Waco is still open. The exhibits still celebrate frontier heroism. The gift shop still sells books that tell the story Texas has always preferred. And the documents in the state archives, the reports and letters and correspondence that describe what actually happened in those camps, are still there, still filed, still available, still waiting for the version of Texas history that includes them. Every nation builds its history from the stories it chooses to tell, and every nation reveals its character through the stories it chooses to leave out. Texas left out the women in the camps, the women on the forced marches, the women in the stockades, the women who watched their children carried away by men on horseback, and by men with clipboards, and by men with policies that accomplished through paperwork what the Rangers had begun with revolvers. Texas left them out because including them would have required admitting that the institution it celebrated most had built its legend on the suffering of people who could not fight back. And that admission was a price Texas was not willing to pay. Now you know what the textbooks did not teach. Now you carry what the archives held, and that matters. Because the women who endured the ranger campaigns and the reservations and the boarding schools left behind almost nothing with their own names on it. They left behind children who became elders, who told stories to grandchildren who were telling them now, in a race against time to preserve what silence almost destroyed. They deserve to be heard. They have waited long enough. If this story matters to you, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because the stories that history tried to bury are the ones that most need telling. Share this video. Drop a comment telling me what part stayed with you, and tell me where you are watching from, because this truth belongs to everyone, not just to Texas. But the American frontier was not the only place where a nation rewrote its own history to hide what it did to women and children. There is another chapter, from another country, where the erasure was even more complete and the silence even deeper. That story is waiting for you now. Click the video on your screen and discover what was buried next.